All right. Well, part of the reason I showed that video last week, for those who were here for it, was to, well, basically that video summarized, I would say, most of this chapter, right? When we're talking about industrialization, industrial revolution, where did it start? How did it affect people? What were the later ramifications? But I'll go over the specifics, of course, for those who weren't here for that video and whatnot. Industrialization, right? When people are talking about artificial intelligence and the effect that will have on society, what effect that will have on the economy, people are really comparing it to industrialization because it's a revolutionary thing, right? Well, the industrialization went through a number of different phases. The first phase was pretty simple industry, but it was machinery, right? Machines taking over more and more of the tasks of people in order to make it, well, free up people from doing a lot of these different things. Industrial Revolution, again, that video I showed you, the reason I showed you a British documentary about it is that was the main focus. Britain had a lot of things going for it, one of which being that it had a lot of coal. Also, in general, Great Britain gets a ton of rain, so it was really great for moving things around, not just creating navies, as they called them, canals, but also Britain had a ton of coal, and it was all very easy to get to as well. It didn't even involve a lot of digging until well much later on. So Britain had a lot of things going for it, right? A lot of things going for it. One of the things that had going for it was it already, had an international range of where it could get its resources from as well, right? So Great Britain was uniquely placed geographically in that context. The video also talked about a lot of things that came with the Industrial Revolution. Pollutants, right? Pollution being a big thing. A thing that a lot of people didn't even understand or comprehend, like what do we have to care about the environment and what is pollution, right? And as other countries have developed, many have wanted to basically skip stages of the Industrial Revolution if they could, because, well, I mean, there were times that bad economically for a lot of people at the very beginning of the Industrial Revolution, as well as people were kind of moving into the cities, the kind of slums and shanty towns we see in many countries today. Those were in Great Britain as well at the early industrialization. But again, like I said, a stage that they wanted to skip. Before that, pre-industrial manufacturing, described as cottage industries. I think I've talked about the example before of, if you wanted some shoes, right? You'd go usually to a family, often the last name would be shoemaker, right? Or if you wanted clothes, you'd go to a family whose name were tailor, and they would take your measurements and they would make your specific garments. That's as opposed to industrialization, right? When you have large machines that are making these things. The other thing is, well, you could make a ton of stuff very cheaply, very fast, but it has to be standardized, right? And so, well, to stick with the example of shoes, early days of shoemakers, they'd be made specifically how you would want, and for your foot, which might have, everyone's foot is different. In the early industrial age, it was like, oh, there's one type of shoe, and that's basically what everyone will get. It's cheap, it's affordable, so everyone could buy shoes. Not only that is it cheap and affordable, but fashions can start to take place of someone wearing a certain type of clothing and you seeing it in a store and you wanting to get that as well, right? Consumption really greatly increased through time. The book has some examples of, I believe it's the candy industry, right? Cottage industry level versus industrial revolution level. You could create a lot more with the machine, but they're all going to be the same. Spread of the Industrial Revolution. If you remember when we were talking about our chapter on agriculture and about how early colonization was very much agriculture was the center of the economy, right? And so countries were taking over areas of the world because what they wanted was large areas of land, because that's what you need for agriculture. With the Industrial Revolution, all of a sudden, the things needed changed quite a bit, right? This map here from our book looking at industrial output in coal deposits. You could also see the geography of coal, which was the main fuel of the Industrial Revolution. Well, the spread of it is, as we say in geography, uneven, right? Some areas have vast amounts, and some areas have none. Now, of course, this map doesn't show that some areas have other fossil fuels. Coal was kind of the first main one, but relatively quickly, as the Industrial Revolution moved on, different types of fossil fuels were used. But those also are spread around in the world in seemingly random amounts, right? Some countries not having any. The other thing, well, with factories making things, all of a sudden it wasn't agriculture that these different countries were looking for, but raw materials and resources, right? Not just coal, but any raw material that you could get from any other countries to use as inputs into your factories, right? The Industrial Revolution also diffused like other ideas and other technologies, starting in Great Britain, and it basically did, well, diffused outward. And you might think, well, why wouldn't everyone just do it immediately? We're talking the time frame, the information still spread pretty slowly, and the actual industrial processes often had to be learned person to person. Different phases of Industrial Revolution, Second Industrial Revolution, electricity, internal combustion, mass production assembly line, right? Again, making things more and more products with less and less inputs. Third Industrial Revolution, computerization and miniaturization. Each phase of industrialization, many countries would go through these phases, but like I said, a lot of countries would skip phases if they could. You know, if they could skip right to later levels. Later levels in the Industrial Revolution tend to make more money, right? So the more your economy is based on these, the more successful it will be. Also a map from our textbook looking at some of the early industrial core in Great Britain, and as you can see, very tied to where the coal is, right? So you had entire industrial towns that rose up that were often out of nothing, that were like very small communities there beforehand. Sectors of the economy. Actually, is there a better chart? Sorry, I'm skipping forward. No, I don't really have a better chart. All right. Like I said, if you move up these sectors, these were came about through different periods of time, but of course now they all exist, and a lot of people would jump into the final level if they could. Some countries have jumped some different levels here and there, but mostly not. And a lot of countries actually find themselves stuck in the primary sector, right? They're stuck in agriculture, extraction of natural resources, and they're having difficulty getting more than that going, right? Basically, if you have a country, let's say you have a country that during the age of colonization, their infrastructure was set up to extract raw material, let's say, I don't know, a copper mine or something. Well, that economy, you have people working in the copper mine, and then, you know, you might have some other people working in agriculture. But in order to move up, you need knowledge and expertise in different things in order to have manufacturing. And if people working in those primary sectors, usually very low paid, well, if everyone in your economy is extremely low paid, it's difficult for them to become consumers to even create demand to move up these different levels of development, right? as I said, a lot of countries find themselves stuck, and they want to move forward. We'll talk about that a bit more in other chapters. Also, the costs of industrialization. Our book talks about a good example of in Brazil. Brazil gets something like 90% of its power from hydroelectric, right? Hydroelectric, which on the one hand doesn't emit fossil fuels, but on the other, there's a lot of environmental costs to putting in large dams. You put in a large dam, that usually means you're gonna have a large reservoir of water, because you have the water coming through the dam, creating power. Like I said, at least it's not releasing carbon, but, well, in the example of Brazil, from our case study, a lot of indigenous populations were displaced, right? And that is a thing that usually happens, because a lot of societies settle along rivers because that's a source of water, and you could go fishing, things like that. And so there's not many rivers around the world that don't have people along their edges. So Industrial Revolution, again, as I mentioned, it diffused this way, and it might seem surprising that it would take decades of time for it to diffuse, but it indeed did. And of course, a lot of industrialists wanted to keep their industrial secrets, right? They wanted there to not be competition. They didn't want others to necessarily know about that. That was the other main advantage of the UK being the first to industrialize. When they started making industrial goods, they had the complete world as their market, right? And so they had cornered the market for a while. And so during this phase of time, they were very economically successful. And then when it started to fuse, then they started getting competition. Well, with industrialization, before that, people were very kind of dispersed across the landscape. You did have cities here and there. Usually they were centers of trade and whatnot, but they weren't cities in the sense that we think of them today, with huge populations. The factory system and industrialization really required a bunch of people to be clustered next to each other, because factories need people, right? You need a lot of people in a specific space. Well, as I said, you had a lot of people in rural areas moving to the cities looking for work. As agricultural jobs went down in how much they were able to pay people, and with mechanization of farming, you needed less people. So all those people moved to cities, and for a while, although there was a revolution and whatnot, there was tough times at first, right? And it wasn't until a bit later that we started to see a rise of a middle class. When you have the rise of a middle class, well, you have a bunch of people who are buying the stuff in factories, right? And so that means more jobs as more people consume. Consuming kind of became the norm. You also had a number of different changes that happened that hadn't happened so much before. Time for recreation, even recreation being a thing. Increasingly, you had more women taking jobs. As I mentioned, public health challenges. Those first cities were pretty toxic, pretty noxious. Just like didn't have a lot of rules about pollutants and stuff. And so not just things from industry, but a whole bunch of people living together, just a lot of diseases. This took a while for basically places to figure out what to do about these things. Through time and through industrialization, through increasing use of technology, as you can see, life expectancy also started going up. This is also the time frame that we started looking at people. If you remember our chapter about population, we started looking at, well, where's this population going? Is this just going to go up forever? Will it ever stabilize? We know today that, most places have actually stabilized. In fact, some places are worried about population decline. Picture from the book, just looking at early cities and early efforts at sanitization. A lot of the earliest cities I mean, they were just covered in garbage because there wasn't really, it cost money to clean up, it cost money to have someone haul away your trash. And when you had all these populations from rural areas moving to the cities, you had huge unemployment, huge amounts of unemployment, plenty of garbage, and not a lot of services to basically pick it up. Sectors of the economy. Well, like I said, these different sectors, you could think of them as the different stages that a lot of economies go through as they develop. And when you're looking at different countries and how kind of developed or not developed they are, usually people look at these economic sectors because the further you are into the sector, the more money your individual people are usually making. Primary sector, right? Removing and harvesting products from the earth, agriculture, fishing, forestry, mining. These are all things that are vital to the economy, but are all usually pretty low paying, right? Secondary sector, production of goods from raw materials, including manufacturing, processing, and construction. Of course, there was a time that this was the height of the economy. This is when people were making most money in this. We have actually moved on largely to a post-industrial economy. Not that we're not still using industry, but most jobs in more developed places have kind of moved on from industrial so much. Next sector, transport, storage, marketing, selling of goods and services. Marketing itself has grown gigantically through time, right? Trying to get people to see the product that they want to buy, right? Or if you can, convince them that they need a product that they maybe have never heard of before, but you need to convince people that they're vitally interested in consuming this product. Next sector, right? Next area of development. Again, this is a vital area, but involving information and environmental technology. There's plenty of countries who just have not moved into this stage, right? Even still today. People are hoping, with advances in technology, more and more places can kind of move up this economic ladder. One of the final phases as far as we know, who knows what will happen in the future, but work in sciences, right? Universities, nonprofits, healthcare, culture, and media. These are the things that are basically making the most money in the more developed economies of the world. This map here shows percentage of your workforce working in agriculture, right? Percentage of your workforce working in agriculture. And of course, agriculture being obviously something that we all need, we all eat. But most places as they develop, more and more of that is mechanized. If you have countries where you have a larger percent of the population working in agriculture, you could even have them growing the same crop that you grow in more developed places. But these people are basically competing with machines in more developed places, right? And that pushes wages lower and lower, unless there's something to move this population into different areas. Like I said, there's a number of places that are a bit stuck. In India, the caste system, there are farming castes, and although they made caste discrimination illegal, there's still plenty of people who will not hire you for different things if they could recognize you're from a farming caste, right? It's difficult if you're in a farming caste to get the education you would need to go into different castes, right? Of course, as I was saying, India being a very big place, different amounts of this in different areas, but there's a lot of agriculture that is still done by hand, right? A person is going to do that if they literally aren't allowed to have any other job. Let's see, what else did I say about that? As I mentioned, we have a bit of a post-industrial economy in the U.S. here. what happened to our industrial economy and manufacturing jobs. They were largely mechanized, right? That seems to be something that eventually happens to all sectors of the economy. Becomes mechanized, have more and more machines doing it, less and less people. You also had a lot of outsourcing, right? As different countries want to develop, China, for example, well, they put in a lot of infrastructure for industry, and they had hoped that that would entice people to locate their manufacturing in China, and it worked very well for China, basically until the pandemic. Not that China still doesn't produce plenty and have plenty of manufacturing, but during the pandemic, because of so much supply interruptions, many countries around the world, not just the US, started kind of turning inward to local sources of things. And although they would be more expensive than the Chinese alternatives, they were reliable, right? And people knew what product they were getting, and they could keep on making the different things they had if they needed inputs from manufacturing. Like I said, this isn't just in the US. China's having a real economic problem right now, because even though several months ago they basically turned a corner and they said, okay, we're all set to go back to our trading relationship with the rest of the world with how it was before the pandemic. But many countries around the world, they had updated their own manufacturing and their own industries, and kept a lot of that local. Let's see. Oh yeah, another chart from our book. So, it either cuts off the top or cuts off the bottom. Gotta choose which part is cut off. Alright, so this will cut off the top. Then we can see these years here. Through time, as you can see, women's participation in the economy in most developed countries increased through time, right? A lot of these divisions by gender of jobs or the lack of jobs, well, it's considered a bit more old-fashioned in places that are a bit more developed, right? I'm going to work with that data. Some specifics about location of industrial location. Well, you can just read it. Businesses locate in places that utilize minimum cost of production, right? So when I mentioned that China, their big effort was to put in a lot of infrastructure for manufacturing to make manufacturing flow as well as possible, as well as being cheaper. And that worked, putting in all that infrastructure. A lot of industry moved there and were able to decrease costs. And then when they decreased costs, companies who competed with them, they had to do the same, right? You had a lot of companies who felt like they had no option other than to either outsource to other countries or automate as much as possible. Important term in economics, agglomeration, tendency of enterprises in the same industry to cluster in the same area. This happens for a number of different reasons. We've talked about the auto industry a bit. This chapter talks about it a bit as well, but Henry Ford, right, creator of the Model T, well, he was from Michigan, so he located his industry in specifically Detroit. He wasn't born in Detroit, but he grew up there. And so Detroit was the center of automobile industry in the US. And so what happened was basically if someone else wanted to go into the automobile industry, they would feel they would have to locate in or near Detroit, because then they could hire people from the existing factories. They could hire people who had some amount of knowledge in that. And so you had a whole kind of cluster develop. Agglomeration and what eventually became called cluster economies, big area of research, especially in geography. But that's part of the reason why, well, when we hit the post-industrial era and these jobs went to China or they are automated, well, Detroit has still never recovered economically, right? And then I would say large areas of Michigan that were also doing a lot of manufacturing, they also never really recovered because their whole economies were based around that one industry. There are other places like the Twin Cities where we did have automobile manufacturing. We had some, but it wasn't the center of our economy. We had other things. So when that happened, our post-industrial age happened. Yes, industry decreased, but there was lots of other things kind of going on. I think the biggest local economic cluster right now in the Twin Cities is biomedical, right? Biomedical, either devices or technology or expertise. Another concept important in economics, break of bulk points, right? Location where it's more economical to break raw materials into smaller units before shipping them further. Right? So in general, when it comes to industries, you have bulk reducing or bulk gaining, right? Bulk gaining, what does that mean? Usually what that means is assembly of stuff, right? So you could have some products, like maybe this, it takes a lot of different components, or you could have one industry that maybe has raw materials, but you actually want to get rid of a lot of the bulk before you ship it out. It would make sense that if you're have a bulky industry, you want to get rid of that bulk before you ship it so that you're paying the cost of transporting less stuff. Main example from the book is the lumber industry, right? Just because that's an industry that very clearly, when you cut down the trees, you have a lot of bulk, right? And you start kind of taking off the parts that are not of use to you, right? And you want to get rid of as much bulk as possible before you then move it, because then you're paying less for transportation of all that stuff. So this map showing the U.S. main manufacturing region. As I was mentioning, Detroit kind of being the center, Flint being another big city, but a number of these places just they've really struggled with coming back economically. I would say in general, the areas that were focused on metals manufacturing have been able to come back a bit better because metals is so much more of a generalized kind of area. East cost theory, the other advantage to these locations were, at the time, the main population center of the U.S. was also in this area, right? And so you had who you're selling your goods to were very near, right? And so that helped reduce your costs. Industrial parks, also kind of one of the newer aspects of manufacturing in the U.S. Like I said, a lot of manufacturing has come back, but not necessarily to these regions. For a number of reasons. A lot of population has moved. A lot of the population that used to be the center of the U.S., we've had a lot of people move to the Sun Belt. We've had a lot of people move to the West Coast. So they have their own markets, and so increasingly industrial parks have been locating closer to those markets when they can. All right, I was going to show an example of board game manufacturing in China. I don't know if people ever heard of Fantasy Flight games? No? People played board games, some board games of some kind or other, Monopoly, or what have you. Fantasy Flight games was, because they were bought out somewhat recently, but they're a local board game manufacturer in Roseville, Minnesota, exotic Roseville, Minnesota. And, they were one of the largest board game companies in the world. A good friend of mine was one of the early people who were working there, and I asked him to take some photos of the factories in China that they had. They, similar to other industry, felt that they could lower costs by putting their manufacturing in China, and it was mostly beneficial. So in a nutshell, Fantasy Flight Games was a small board game company that had like a dozen people. And they used to assemble the board games themselves. That's why they were located in Roseville. There was a lot of warehouse space to do it, right? And so they would just set up a bunch of tables, and they basically spend a lot of their time, like if you've ever played a board game, like you open it up and there's all these pieces and stuff, right? Well, someone has to put all that stuff together. They found themselves doing that when they wanted to spend their time thinking of new games and doing the more artistic side of it. So their hope was if they located their manufacturing to China, then they could all focus on that. And that was mostly successful for a good amount of time. Well, like I said, I had a good friend of mine who I asked him to take photos. So normally these PowerPoints are done by me, but these were done by my friend who went there. This is one of their factories, book printing press, right? These board games have these little books with the rules and stuff. Yeah, you may notice that Mitsubishi is not a Chinese name, although it's a factory in China. Japan being, Japan had industrialized before China, especially when it comes to high-end manufacturing. So China actually buys a lot of its equipment from neighboring Japan. Oh, this is his fancy hotel that he just wanted to, and he thought that this was a funny thing for a door to say. So board games, they're actually tend to be more popular in Europe. And in fact, during the pandemic, especially, there was a big turn toward board gaming in Europe for a number of reasons. One being, when people were kind of all locked up and you're in your house and it's the whole family, they're like, well, what's something the whole family can do? So a lot of people turn to board games. So a competing company, Asmodee, who's located in Germany, they did better economically during the pandemic, and so they eventually bought out Fantasy Flight Games. Well, one of the things about board games is, if you could just easily change the language on these things and sell the same game to lots of places around the world. This is some of the factories are in the area called Macau, which is a former Portuguese colony. Walking district of Macau. In general, most areas around the world have more walking districts. If you've ever been to Portugal, you'll see that it's very similar as far as architecture. I forget, anyone been to Macau? Anyone been to China? It's in the tropics, we've talked about the difficulties of tropics developing. It's a place that has definitely developed printing press. These are the board game cards before you put the language and whatnot on them. Another printing press. This is a Korean game. Part of why they located in China, and actually a lot of manufacturing locate in China, is because they also, like when we look at break and bulk points, well, there's a huge market there, right? A huge market. And so their hopes were, if they located their factories there, not only could they make their stuff cheaper, but maybe they would get, the more than 1 billion people who live in China to buy their product. It had very mixed results. And also what they basically did was they took all the process and all the stuff of what they did here in Roseville and just shipped it over and had people doing the same process. But at lower wages, right? These are some of the pieces. When I say board games, they own the right to like the Lord of the Rings, as far as board games, the Star Wars franchise, like a lot of these big franchises that people buy, kind of complicated board games. If you haven't done them yourselves, perhaps you know someone who maybe spends too much time playing these types of board games. But if you ever opened up something and it has little pieces that are all kind of stuck together, Well, that's because that's how they're created. Is you have a plastic mold and you fill it with plastic, and so you have your little pieces. Sculptors also working in China, and what they would do is they would be working with local artists in Minnesota, and they would basically send models back and forth and ask for fine tune of different pieces for these board game pieces. This is just them going out to lunch. Puzzles, very popular internationally. Oh, this is a fancy hotel again. Secondary factory that they had newly opened. There's a similar picture to this in our book showing shipping containers, and that also being a kind of a big step in the increase of global products was the ease that shipping containers can be moved around. Like I said, they hoped to sell locally, and that didn't actually go great for a number of reasons. One of the main ones being bootleg copies of things. I don't know people if you know what a bootleg is. Basically, well, I don't know if I talked about the example of me buying DVDs in China. I was just like walking down the street, and there are DVD stores kind of all over. This was a number of years back. DVD stores are less popular these days. But I went in the DVD store and bought a number of DVDs, and they looked like regular DVDs to me. It wasn't until I got home and played some of them that I saw that, well, they were bootlegs, meaning if they're an older movie, someone just copied the DVD over, and the DVD that I bought, what was printed on it was often inaccurate information that they knew would just kind of look correct. So at the time, this is a dozen years ago, I bought all the Harry Potter movies on DVD. I was like, oh, now I can own the Harry Potter movies. I found out when I put them into my DVD player that it was just the first half of the movies, because that's all the capacity of those DVDs had, right? Making bootleg copies of things happens so much in China that a lot of manufacturing found that once the patterns and whatnot to those products were kind of overseas, competing factories would spring up making bootleg versions, and they would not pay the original people. So you wouldn't think necessarily that something like a board game would be something that would be worth making a copy of and selling your own version of it. But that's also another reason why a lot of companies that had located in China, they'd hope to break into that market, but if the locals are just making cheap knockoff versions of your product, it's kind of like, well, is that really benefiting us to be over there if people aren't even buying our product? Not only that, but they're creating competition that are literally stealing our product and selling it on the market. These are problems that have been talked about in China for a long time, and also for a long time China had said they would upgrade their regulation and they would get rid of this type of industry, but they really hadn't, right? And so these were a number of the things that were kind of taken into account when places decided if they're going to stay located in China or not. Okay. All right, as always, going to have you work on some